So the first thing that I kind of wanted to mention was that this sermon series, Altered, is based on a book called Altered by Susan O. Kent. And so we really use this book as kind of an inspiration. The sermon series is not a step-by-step overview of the book. So this book is excellent. And if you are interested in diving deeper into the subjects that we're talking about over this brief sermon series, I would highly recommend this book. It's set up as a Lenten devotional with one day for every day of Lent, but you don't have to read it that way. I would recommend one per day to really stew on each lesson, and it's really only about 2 to 3 pages a day. It takes probably less than 5 minutes to read it, and it's great. So I wanted to throw that out there as a recommendation. So, what comes to mind when you think about making a sacrifice to God? If you think about it in terms of the Old Testament, you might think about the type of offering that God requires from the Israelites, an offering of an animal or a portion of that year's harvest. In the original covenants of the Old Testament, that's kind of how it works, right? The Israelites were God's favorite people, and He told them that they would be His prized possession if they would just follow the 613 rules that He laid out for them. But since they were human, that didn't work out so well. So God designed this system where they could earn back His favor. They would have to take something of value to them and offer it to God as a sacrifice on the altar. And there were different prices for different transgressions. There were different types of offering that they could make for a sin against God or a sin against another person. And there were even some types of offerings that were required just for regular maintenance. But God required that the Israelites give up something of value that was pleasing to God. Things like first fruits of the vine and the very finest, unblemished animals. Things that would cause a little bit of pain to give up. Let's think about that. Imagine that you're in the livestock business. Or even better yet, let's not imagine that. Let's imagine that you only have a few animals that you keep to be food for your family. And now we're going to imagine that we live back in the times of the Old Testament, and God requires that you sacrifice one of these animals. That's what's expected. That's okay. That's not the surprising part about this. But imagine that there's this burden of raising an extra animal that you know you're going to sacrifice at the altar. It's not a question of whether you're going to sacrifice. We're going to assume that you're going to. But you do have to acknowledge that regardless of whether it's expected or not, it's still going to sting a little bit, right? The sacrifices that the Israelites made probably felt like they cost something. But in this case, it's one of those things where it hurts for a good reason, right? Like when you get sore after doing exercise. The pain was worth it because of what they received, which was God's favor and grace. But if you think about offerings and sacrifices in terms of the New Testament, what comes to mind then? One of the main themes of Christianity is that Jesus' act of saving us from the power of sin and death negated the need for regular animal or crop offerings. Jesus himself was the ultimate sacrifice. We could never offer enough to earn the love of God. So God sent His one and only Son to be a sacrifice for us, to ransom us from our sins. So what does a sacrifice mean to a Christian, a Christ follower? You might think that making a sacrifice as a Christian means giving up something valuable in the hopes that God would give you something worthwhile. And your thought process might go like this. If I deprive myself of something that I want, maybe it will earn me some kind of special favor. Our human minds, they still want sacrifice to be transactional, like it was in the time of the Old Testament. If I give God X, God will give me Y. However, the New Testament shows us that God's love doesn't really work that way. And the quintessential Bible story that you can't talk about sacrifice or offering without talking about this is the story of Abraham and Isaac from Genesis 22. But if we're not careful, I think that story can skew our expectation of what a sacrifice is meant to be. So if you're not familiar with the story, here it is, the paraphrased version. After 100 years of not being able to have a child of their own, God blessed Abraham and his wife Sarah with a son named Isaac. But when Isaac was still young, God kind of unexpectedly asked Abraham to take Isaac up a mountain and sacrifice him as a burnt offering. And being the devout man that he was, Abraham obeyed God's command, even though it must have been devastating. But just as Abraham raised the knife to slay his long-awaited heir, an angel stopped him and said, "Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son," which is the second part of Genesis 22:12. And this story, it can mean different things to different people. A lot of people will hear this story and think that it demonstrates that God works in a very transactional way. If you're willing to give up something valuable to you, then God will bless you. And I'll admit that's the way I understood this story for a long time. And it makes it seem like one way to get on God's good side is to give up the gifts that we prayed for. But when you think about it that way, the conclusion that you come to is that we really shouldn't want anything because God can always take it back, right? But when we listen to the story of Abraham and Isaac from that perspective, the end of the story just kind of feels like a relief, like, whew, I'm glad God let me keep my treasure this time. But I think when we think about it that way, we miss the point. The idea wasn't for God to deprive Abraham of his son just to test his obedience. The idea was for Abraham to trust God. And so if Abraham was willing to sacrifice his own son, his most precious possession, then it showed that he had unlimited trust in God. And more than just giving up possession of his son, Abraham was willing to give up his control. After he'd prayed 100 years for an heir, I have to imagine that Abraham protected Isaac and kept him out of danger as much as he possibly could. He had to have tried to control everything that he possibly could. But God asked Abraham to allow Isaac's safety to be outside of his control. So we're going to talk about control quite a bit. So what I want to do first is talk about what is control. So control is the power to regulate, direct, or dominate. We typically like to have control over just about every aspect of our lives. And I think that this condition is a result of the very human desire for freedom. Not just freedom in our actions, but every aspect of our lives, from our jobs to our hobbies to what we eat for dinner and everything in between. However, what we find is that having too much control actually creates more restriction than freedom. We become bound by our desire to dictate our own circumstances, and when that doesn't happen, we experience some emotions that we don't really like. We become fearful of the unknown, of not knowing what happens next, and we can become anxious because we try to fill in the blank of what might happen next. We can't stand it when things happen that we aren't prepared for, so we lock ourselves inside a cage where we can at least attempt to control everything that happens to us and our loved ones. But when we get into this situation, fear and anxiety pull us away from God. We can't fully focus on living like Jesus when we're worried. But at the same time, I think being worried, having worries, is a pretty universal experience. So as we come up to our time of prayer this morning, I want you to think about this. What do you have in your life that you keep completely under your control? And when you have that thing in mind, the next thing that I want you to think about is, does it cause you comfort to have that control, or does it cause you anxiety to have that control? So I'll tell you mine. It's finances. When I start to feel like our finances are falling outside of my control, I fall apart. I've got work to do as much as everybody else does. And I'm sure there are things that have the same effect on people here. I have to imagine that health is probably a big one. Safety might be another, or security, or maybe you have a loved one that you see making a mistake or some series of mistakes. So think about what causes this type of anxiety for you as we sing our call to prayer together. So we've acknowledged that we like to maintain control in our lives, but that we don't feel too great when we start to lose that control. So what do we do about it? So this is where we come to today's scripture reading, which is Romans 6:13, and it says, "Do not offer any part of yourself to sin as an instrument of wickedness, but rather offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and offer every part of yourself to Him as an instrument of righteousness." Now, I really want to focus on that last part, so I'm going to read it again. It says, offer every part of yourself to Him as an instrument of righteousness. Sacrifice doesn't have to be about giving up something valuable or important. It's about surrender in all aspects of our lives. We have an altar right here in this room. But what we don't do is offer animal sacrifices at this altar. Jesus made it so we didn't have to do that. So why do we have an altar at all? It's because even though we no longer have to sacrifice our crops and our livestock, we can still offer ourselves or aspects of ourselves to God. That's why we have altar calls. When we invite people to kneel at the altar, we're inviting them to give something of themselves to God. And let me tell you this, God's not picky. He loves you as you are, and sometimes what you need to give God is something that you might not think He wants. Something like your anxiety, for instance. Why would God want your anxiety? And He wants it because He wants what's best for us. And our worries are nothing to God. What's hard for us is easy for God. So when we offer our worries to Him, He takes care of them for us by having ultimate control. But that's one of those things that's easy to say and hard to do, isn't it? What does it really mean to surrender? Well, first you have to be able to recognize what's causing the fear and anxiety. And just even thinking about it can be really uncomfortable. But you can ask God to help you with that. In your prayer time, you can ask God to show you what causes those negative emotions, and trust me, He'll do it. The Holy Spirit will have no hesitation in showing you what's leading you away from God. So once you've found the source of your anxiety, the next step is a really important one that, again, is much easier said than done. You have to acknowledge that God has ultimate control over everything. And I mean really acknowledge it. It's so much more than just slapping a bumper sticker on your car that says God's in control. It means that you have to genuinely see that in the end, the war is won. No matter what happens here on earth, God has already won. And we have to genuinely believe that, because this kind of sacrifice won't work very well if we don't. So once we've seen that the earthly battle ends in heavenly victory, you can begin to lay down the things that force you away from God. You can give your control over to God, knowing that He's ultimately victorious over all. Through God, our earthly fear and anxiety and worry will be washed away. And one more time, it sounds easy, but it's not. What does it look like in practice? For me, with my anxiety about finances, it would look like laying my sense of control on the altar. It would be me acknowledging that no matter what happens in my lifetime, God is ultimately in control. But here's the important part of all of it. What do we gain from it? What good does it do to practice sacrificing our control to God? And this is why it's important. It's because it allows us to reclaim the headspace that will allow us to love God better and love each other better. So why is that important? It's It's because that's what Jesus told us to do. He said that the two greatest commandments are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Imagine how much better you could love God and each other if you had nothing to worry about. I've often heard Pastor Justin say that what's important to you is what you're thinking about right now. He usually says this in reference to Soup for the Soul. He says people have a hard time experiencing God when their stomachs are growling. And in the same vein, people have a hard time loving God and each other when they're worried about other things, especially things that are beyond their control. So, if we could somehow manage to miraculously vanquish all our fears and anxieties, imagine how much better life would be. Are we ever going to be able to experience heaven on earth? I don't know, but I kind of don't think so, at least not in the near future. But we can certainly get closer if we're mindful about what we're doing. But one of the ways to get closer to knowing what heaven is like is if we could lay our worries down at God's altar. But in order for it to work, it has to be sustainable. Unfortunately, this isn't going to be a one-and-done, easy thing, and we have to recognize that. In the Deuteronomic laws, there's a rule that the flame of the altar must be kept burning constantly. And in the same way, we have to make sure that we are constantly reminding ourselves to keep up our sacrifice. It's a daily exercise, and like all exercises, it'll become easier with time. So if you want an example of how it works to constantly be mindful of our sacrifices, think about fasting. Fasting is a type of sacrifice. You can give up food for a certain period of time. And while there are lots of spiritual benefits to fasting, one of them that comes to mind with this subject is that it's a constant reminder of God's presence. Every time your stomach rumbles, it's a reminder that God is with you and that He'll sustain you through your brief period of hunger. And it can be the same way with control. Whether your fear or anxiety rises up like a hunger pain, it can be a reminder that God is the one in control. And it's okay when those things rise to the surface because it's an opportunity for us to re-offer our sacrifice and to remind ourselves once again that there's power beyond our own control. So every time worry pops up, think about it or pray about it. But you might find it helpful to shift your perspective a little bit. It's right and it's good to ask God for the outcome that you want. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's also important that we understand that it may not happen the way we want it to. In fact, Jesus models this for us when He prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. He asked the Father to take this cup from me, but at the end of His prayer, He ends with, "But not my will, but yours be done." So this is Jesus saying, here's what I want, but if that's not the way it turns out, it's okay because you're in control. So sacrificing your control to God may not seem like a typical offering, but is it really all that different from giving up something valuable? Your sense of control may actually be even more valuable than anything else you could give. Think about it. What do we guard more jealously than our sense of control? That's one of the last things that we'll let go of. We'll spend every penny we have to maintain control over our lives, but when everything else is gone, we still want that dominion over our circumstances. So like I said earlier, when we try to dictate our own circumstances, we lock ourselves inside these cages of control. But God holds the key to that cage. And by acknowledging that the war is won, we are free from the bonds that hold us back from loving God and loving each other.